My dad worked for Clark Equipment Company, and he worked first shift, which meant that he would get out of work somewhere around 3:30. And there was kind of a routine that he would come home, he'd clean up a little bit from after work. We always had an early dinner, and then he would approach the place in the house that no one would dare else go to, his chair. His lounge chair. That was his chair. That was his sacred space. And I felt like I was getting away with something as a young child if I could ever sit in that chair, which I always tried to make a point of doing when he wasn't in the house, right? Kind of like your pet, when you're gone, they jump up on the furniture they're not supposed to be on. And that was a sacred space, and it was actually marked out in a completely sacred territory because it was perfectly aligned with the TV set, which, as you may remember, was black and white, the rotary dial. And I don't know about your TV set, but our TV set also had an indentation on the right-hand side on the top from going bang to help tune it sometimes. And next to his chair was the TV guide, and then a book by, I think his name was Leonard Maltin at the time, who would write a book that contained a review of every movie that had been available at that time. So he would look at the TV guide, and he would see what was coming on, he'd look in the movie book, is that something that I want to see, and would plan that. And that was his sacred space. And those were some of the sacred instruments of the TV and the TV guide. My brother and I one time decided to play a joke because the TV guide came every Sunday with a newspaper. And so we grabbed the Sunday paper and put the old TV guide in it. And then when the paper, my dad was in the room, we opened it up and went, oh, the TV guide, and we both grabbed it and said, I want it, and then purposely tore it in half in front of his eyes. And the look of shock was tremendous and priceworthy, but also the look of relief when he saw we were playing a joke on him. And that was kind of the sacred space, and that was his place. Well, on a vastly larger scale, in the city of Jerusalem long ago, there was the temple, and the temple was the sacred place. It was what everything else was defined and centered around. And when we think of the temple, I'm not sure that we really fully grasp how big and how important that is, but it truly was the center of the community. And King Herod, who was in authority at that time, was one who was kind of had one foot in the Roman world and one foot in the Jewish world. He wasn't really accepted by many of the Jews because of the way and his lineage of how he came into the office. So he was always trying to placate one group over the other, trying to walk a thin line. And one of the ways that he felt that he could help get in favor with the Jewish community that rejected him was to do a massive rebuilding project on the temple. That began somewhere around 20 BC and continued on for actually until it wasn't completely finished until 63 AD. So it was a massive, massive project. To get the feel for the scope of this building, imagine something somewhat shaped like this, where each side was 500 yards, so 1,500 feet, by 300 yards, by 900 feet. That's roughly the dimension of that. And then it had raised platforms. Some people estimate that it could hold up to 75,000 people. So we're talking about a massive structure that is the focus of the community, and that national identity is really centered on the temple. It's in this temple that John had a visitation, or John the Baptist's father had a visitation, saying, hey, John the Baptist is on the way. It's in this very temple that Jesus was taken to, and where he was blessed by Simeon. And it was in this temple that Jesus, as a 12-year-old boy, was hanging around, much to the fright of his parents, of wondering where he was. It was the major center. And this account that we read in John, that is called the cleansing of the temple, this is a big deal. Now, when we look at this particular account, it is found in all 4 Gospels. Now, the first 3 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, place the cleansing of the temple at the last week of Jesus' life. And so, when you're reading those Gospels, this particular story comes up later in the text. And Mark only has 16 chapters, and this story comes in Mark chapter 11. John is unique in that John has it in the 2nd chapter, and he just says in Passover, and he places that story right in the beginning of Jesus' ministry. If we were to look at the Gospel of John, we would read of where Jesus' first miracle of turning water into wine. And then the very next story that John presents is the story of Jesus cleansing the temple. Mark does it quite interesting, where he sandwiches that story in between the cursing of the fig tree. And many people say maybe that story of the fig tree has some connection with the temple. We'll think about that in a little bit. So, what's going on at the temple? It is Passover. People are coming, and they need to conduct business in order to make purchases to be able to offer a sacrifice. Every region kind of had its own money, and the temple area had its own currency. And so it was necessary to always go and to trade currency. If any of you have traveled internationally, you know what difficulty and frustration that can be to have the wrong currency, and also at times the highway robbery associated with trying to transfer your currency from something that has value to you but apparently to no one else, and they always seem to make that transaction work in their favor, don't they? I recall coming back from the Ukraine, and silly me, I'm in Ukraine. I didn't change my currency. I was flying to Finland, Helsinki, and I thought, well, if planes fly from Ukraine to Helsinki, that the currency exchange will take that. And they looked at me and they're like, no. And so I had $900 worth of Ukrainian currency that was about $100+ in the United States currency that I couldn't do anything with. Thankfully, my son came over from Russia, and I said, you find something to do with this. Here's $100 that I can't use. And he did. And so in the midst of this transaction and in this business that's going on in the church, we see Jesus coming in, and we see a side of Jesus that we don't see or maybe teach very often. We like to think of Jesus as the good shepherd, as Jesus is the one who is a bruised reed he will not break, one who is of great compassion and a healer. And here we see Jesus making a whip. And I can't help but wonder if maybe this is the first instance of where the saying, whip something into shape, came into being, that Jesus makes a whip and he turns over the tables and he makes a huge statement, and he says, you have taken this place that is to be a house of prayer and turned it into a den of thieves or a house of robbery. Isn't it amazing how something that begins with one thing can all of a sudden somehow morph into something else? This happens often in churches. This happens in our personal life. I remember walking to a friend's house and stepping inside. This was a ranch home with a breezeway and a garage. And I come into the garage and I turn into the breezeway, and here is a vast hole. And the man standing there in the hole with a shovel. And I'm like, what happened? He said, a doorknob broke. And I'm like, would you mind explaining? And he's like, well, as I was thinking about fixing the door, he's like, oh, the door was never hung right. And so the wall wasn't square, and so I had to remove the wall. And then as long as I had removed the wall and I had that empty space, I thought, gee, I'd kind of like to extend the basement underneath. And I got out of there before anything else happens. But things tend to morph, and things tend to lose their focus sometimes. And that happens not only in individual life, but it sometimes happens in the church, where the church's main marching orders are to love God with heart, mind, and soul, and to love neighbor as we love ourselves, but we somehow get involved in lesser things. And sometimes God has to do something dramatic in order to correct and to bring us back into focus. And that is exactly what we see happening here. And I'm sure that people who were in the temple and were responsible for the daily operations thought that they were doing a good thing, that they were offering a good service, and what's the harm with making a little money? And it's just very subtly things move away from the center point. Remember a couple weeks ago when I talked about the difference 1 degree makes over time? Someone once said that oftentimes when looking in a religious or movement, and they want to keep it all M's, and so they use the word man. It begins with a man, and it becomes a movement, but then it becomes a machine, and finally a monument, because it loses its purpose and it loses its way. I think today's scripture, especially placed in the season of Lent, is calling us and inviting us to say, Jesus, what tables in my heart, in the temple of my heart, need to be overturned, so that I might be clearly focused and engaged on the very things that you want me to be engaged. And I think that answer is probably different for each and every one of us. I remember hearing somebody once say, I knew that I was taking my faith seriously when I put my bass boat up for sale. Because his bass boat was where he was on Sunday mornings. And he said, I need to be in church. And is there anything wrong with fishing? Absolutely not. Unless it gets in the way of what God would have you be doing. It can be something very insignificant. Take a dime. And if you take this dime, which is small and it is thin, if you hold it up in front of your eye, how much of your vision does it cloud? What the scripture is saying, I think in part, is this: to allow God to remove those things and to overturn those things that keep us from fully worshiping and fully serving. And that is, at times, an uncomfortable process. It is a good sign, and I'm quoting a Christian author, that you have created God in your own image if that God hates the same people you hate. Because what I find is that God is often calling me to stretch my boundaries far beyond what I thought myself capable of. Remember my first sermon. This will always be a theme that I will drive home for as long as you endure me. That God comforts the afflicted and afflicts the comfortable. And that we must never allow ourselves to be comfortable and to have a tame Jesus in our hearts. But we must have Jesus in our hearts, who also contains, at times, has been known to build the whip and to make us uncomfortable and to drive us back into areas that we have strayed away from. Maybe innocently, but places that we need to get refocused on. I can think of no better way to begin that journey of refocusing and of recommitment than by coming to the communion table. Of saying, Jesus, you are the author and finisher of my faith. I celebrate your life, your death, your resurrection, and I commit myself to you, and lead me even into the uncomfortable areas of where I need to be with your Spirit. Show me how to serve. Show me who to love. Help me be the person you want me to be, wherever that may be. Scary words, but they are the right words. And they are the words that, when followed, will be treated and responded to by God this way. Well done, good and faithful servant. Let us hear what the Spirit of God is speaking to us as individuals and as a church. And let the Spirit of God turn the tables that need to be turned. And may we hear and live, putting first things first, loving God with heart, mind, and soul, and truly loving neighbor as we love ourselves. Amen? Amen. Amen. As we